Caring for Creation. She's co-chair of Presbyterians for Carbon Dividends, a volunteer group committed to engaging Presbyterians at all levels in climate action and advocacy, particularly for a carbon pollution fee and dividend, which has been supported by the 223rd and 225th General Assemblies of PCUSA. She's an elder with the Presbyterian Church in Michigan and co-chair of the church's Creation Care team. We also have Curtis Baysinger. He's a clinically retired faculty member from the Department of Anesthesiology at Vanderbilt University. He is faculty for courses on human health and climate change in the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine, and frequently presents to faculty, community medical groups, and congregations. He's an elder at Westminster Presbyterian Church in Nashville, Tennessee, and leads their Earth Care Task Force, is treasurer of Nashville Chapel, the National Chapter of Interfaith Power and Light, and is a member of Presbyterian for Carbon Dividends. He is co-lead of the Middle Tennessee chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. Today, the presentation will be Why a Carbon Pollution Fee? And with that, I will leave it to Linda and Curtis.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Mindy said, my name is Linda Racine with Presbyterian Church in Traverse City, Michigan.
I'm Curtis Baysinger. I'm an elder at Westminster in Nashville.
Okay. And this Presbyterians for Carbon Dividends, it's an action team within Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a nonpartisan volunteer group with over 200,000 supporters around the country and another 20,000 plus around the world in 51 other, well, actually 200 other countries. That Citizens Climate Lobby has 14 different faith-based groups. So they're Catholic, Methodists, Evangelicals, Jewish, Buddhists, and of course Presbyterians. So Curtis and I are part of a national team of about 70 Presbyterians who are working to engage folks at all levels, presbyteries, churches, and individuals in climate action and advocacy. There's certainly a lot of things that need to be done to help restore creation in a just, sustainable way. One of the things that we've been focused on, one of many policy approaches, is a price on carbon pollution. And hopefully by the end of the hour, it will be clear why. So I'd like to share the screen and review our agenda. Okay, so first we'd like to take a few minutes to look at what policies PCUSA passed through last General Assembly. Then we'll review where are we right now with our current trajectory as far as greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And then we'll look at what else is needed to close the gap. We'll explain how carbon fee and dividend works, and then there should be plenty of time for Q&A, and then we'll close with outlining what we can do as individuals or as churches. So, last summer, our General Assembly took some really bold action to support climate, which was fantastic. And you may be aware of these. We'd like to take a quick look at each one. A couple of themes through these. Some focus on personal action, what we individually can do, and others look at more systems change, the policies that we need to meet the Paris Agreement and truly build an environmentally just future. Okay. So one of the first ones, investing in a green future. This paper really lays out the foundation for action and advocacy. It outlines what we should do and why we need to do it. As far as personal action goes, it encourages us all to work toward 100% renewable energy by 2030. It also makes restoring creation a key piece of the Matthew 25 programming. It has a long list of policies that it recommends supporting because they address pollution, move us away from fossil fuels, and addresses environmental justice issues. And it also encourages us to make use of all the resources that are available through PCUSA, and there are so many. And as far as the why we should be doing these things, It's pretty clear that we are in crisis. It says we face the existential threat of climate change destroying God's creation and the future of humanity and living creatures. Wow, that is a bold statement. And it points out how already, as we know, vulnerable communities of color and poor are experiencing profound effects. We see that around the world. So now is the time to act. Another overture that passed kind of builds on the first one. It sets an interim target for reducing our carbon footprint 25% in the next 4 years. GA also approved creating the Presbyterian Tree Fund, which is up and running. This overture asks us to look at our own lifestyle. Are there ways that we can reduce the amount of flying that we do? But when we do choose to get on an airplane, there's a way we can offset those emissions by contributing to the fund. Another overture highlights a really important international focus called 30 by 30. You may have heard of this. Its goal is to set aside at least 30% of lands and waters as protected by 2030. The graph in the upper right shows that right now we're at about 15% of land and 8% of waters. So we've got some work to do. And scientists are telling us if we don't act, we could lose 1 million species of plants and animals. So President Biden issued an executive order in 2021 supporting this goal, but as we know, executive orders can be vulnerable. So the overture asks us to support the U.S. and the UN goal, and it also asks us to advocate for Indigenous sovereignty and treaty rights. Those are upheld. Okay, and the next one, the MRTI report. There was an extensive
Excuse me a second, please. This is Jim Turner. I need to be set as co-host. Sorry.
Oh, sure.
You should see the prompt now to move back. Apologies to Linda and Curtis. Jim, please remain muted, and we'll move you there.
Yeah. No worries. Okay. So the MRTI report, we'll just highlight a couple of things that happened in that. First, it recommended divesting from these 5 companies, said we've been working with them, they're not meeting our standards and so it's time to divest. It also recommended continuing with the Climate Action 100 companies process and add these companies to the list. And then finally, the General Assembly took pieces of 4 different overtures that had been proposed and added them to 09, which is on actions in support of an energy transition. And if you were there last summer, you know that divestment was a big topic. 2 of these overtures recommended totally divesting from all fossil fuel companies on the Carbon Underground list. And it was a close vote. Motion during the plenary session failed by only 6 votes. And there were 2 sessions yesterday that went into a lot more detail. This discussion, no doubt, goes on, but here's a brief look at what the GA approved last summer. They decided that we should ramp up our investment strategy, make sure it aligns with the Paris Agreement, should be reaching out to the top 50 emitters, ratchet up the screening criteria, and work at a faster pace. The clock is really ticking on climate change. This overture also reminds us that we have a lot of Presbyterians who work in the fossil fuel industry, and we need to support them in this transition to clean energy. It sets an even more aggressive target than those earlier 2 overtures by saying we should shoot for being carbon neutral, net zero, or even climate positive by 2030. And it also reemphasizes a policy that was approved in 2019 called On Support of Carbon Pricing. And we'll get into more detail on that in just a few minutes. So that's a quick overview of PCUSA policy. What about in Washington? Now, I don't know about you, but I hear people say, they're not doing anything in DC. Well, actually, there has been some action, and some of it is even bipartisan. Curtis?
Thank you, Linda. And Mark ended his talk last hour on a note of hope. And it's the fact that Washington in the last 2.5 years has passed 4 bills that have major climate impact that continues to give me hope. And let's just review them very quickly. First slide, next slide, please. It's hard to imagine that a piece of healthcare legislation could actually be viewed as a climate change abatement measure. But this bill was, and it did 2 very important things in addition to addressing the COVID problem. First of all, it re-emphasized our commitment to phasing out hydrofluorocarbons because of their destructive effect on the ozone, and also they are potent greenhouse gases. And it also committed $300 million for upscaling of the grid, and that itself would have been the largest investment that the United States has made in decades in our grid system. But next slide, please. That was overshadowed by the second bill, which was the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, passed about a year later. Notice that we shifted from investing millions of dollars to billions with a B, and that grid infrastructure uptake and upgrade, as well as investments in public transportation and electric vehicle charging, were part of it. But most significantly, this bill provided billions of dollars for climate resilience that frontline communities and communities along our shore and coastal area are going to need to deal with climate change. Next slide, please. The third act was actually supposed to be a way of bringing chip manufacturing back to the United States. However, it had the ability of improving the growth of zero carbon industries by providing chips that are going to be necessary for that to occur. And more significantly, it provided a few $billion with regard to climate related research, which is going to be needed for us to transition to a zero carbon economy. And finally, next slide, please. The big kahuna, which has been talked about extensively at this conference, and I'm not really going to go into the details, but it covers almost all the fronts, providing tens of billions of dollars now for forestry measures, for improving natural climate solutions by putting char back into agriculture, $10 billion for us to be able to go ahead and re-electrify our homes and improve their insulation. And most significantly, a huge commitment, nearly $60 billion, related to environmental justice and to poorer communities who are going to be disaffected disproportionately by climate change. Next slide, please. Now, this busy slide on the right shows a chart of what we as individuals will be able to access. And for those of you who have listened to the presentations on the Inflation Reduction Act and what it might mean to us, and you've not had a chance to go ahead and see how you can benefit and your neighbors can benefit, take a moment now, please, and take your phone. Those of you that are in the audience there in West Virginia, or in Virginia, excuse me, just put your phone up to this QR code here. We'll take you to a website at Rewiring America. They outline the benefits and a way that you can, actually a roadmap by which you can just go ahead and access it. So take a moment now, maybe 10 or 15 seconds, those of you at home or wherever you're zooming in and those in the audience, put your phone up to the QR code and download it, if you would. So I'm going to stop flapping my jaw here for a minute and let you all do that. So, now, one thing that is incredibly important to us is how the poor among us are going to be affected and improved. And the Inflation Reduction Act disproportionately gives more money towards people with lower income. Up to 50% of the cost of improving electrification in the home and improving the ability for people to insulate their homes is going to be covered by the IRA. and up to 100% of that coverage is for very low income families. Next slide, please. Significantly, our congregations can benefit. And the reason is that heretofore, since congregations are nonprofit organizations, we were unable to access tax credits that had been existing in previous law. Now, because of direct payment, we can access them. There's an extra 20% credit that will be made available to those that are, again, in poorer communities. Next slide, please. Now, where does this put us on the track to cutting greenhouse gas emissions? Well, if you look at this graph, the red line at the top shows that we would receive 27 or 28% emissions reductions from 2005 if we pursued this. We can realize about a 40% reduction if we enact permitting reform, because that will allow all the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act to be realized. However, you know, our Paris commitments, the United States Paris commitments and the Paris Accords made in 2015, say that we need to have a 50% cut by 2030. So the question is, what are we going to do to bridge the gap between where we're going and where we need to be? And Linda's going to show us now how to do that. So, all right, Linda, take it away. Thanks.
Well, first, to everyone here, what would you do if you were in charge? You know, as Curtis pointed out, there's a lot of good policy in place, and we still have a gap to bridge. And the other piece of this is that all those policies are U.S. policies, and climate truly is a global issue. So if you were in charge, what would you do? Put your ideas in the chat, and let's see what people are thinking. What other policies might you put in place to make a difference? Anyone? Ideas?
Has anybody in the conference room raised their hand?
Yeah, this is June, and I would stop giving any subsidies to fossil fuel companies and instead take that money and invest it in conserving energy or creating renewable energy.
Okay.
I'd be concerned about those folks that are currently in the fossil fuel industry. It's not their fault that their industry is hopefully going to go away. So we should be focused on trying to retrain those folks into jobs that can support their families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very important point, isn't it? Retraining.
The big emitters are steel, cement, shipping, and all that is convertible with hydrogen, you know, not necessarily batteries. So it seems to me we've got to get that moving much quicker.
Okay.
I would calculate the externalized costs that come from fossil fuel to be able to incorporate that into the pricing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. These are really good suggestions.
Oh, we have one more here in the room.
Oh, sure.
To go off of a comment already, in West Virginia, it has been a real problem of the people that were in the coal industry, and they have been, you know, out of jobs. They're unable to, there's training programs, but unfortunately the education system sometimes doesn't support that. And so it's very important that we plan on getting these people retrained, because then it becomes hopeless for them.
Yes, and there is a program, or a group called Reimagine Appalachia, which some of you may be familiar with, that is working very hard on some of those key issues that you outlined. How do we retrain folks who have worked in the coal industry in the clean energy economy. And there's certainly just excellent work going on in that, and that's a really important piece. Okay. Well, to test some of these ideas, there's some very smart folks at MIT put together the simulator where we can plug in different policy scenarios and look at their impact on global temperature. So there's a QR code here. If you want to pull this simulator up yourself on your phone, you can explore it. We'll also share that link later. I'd like to go to the En-ROADS website so we can see. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. It's a very, very rich model, and we're not going to get into all the detail of it, but point out a couple of things. In this graph right here, you see our current trajectory globally for carbon emissions, or for global temperature, excuse me, for global temperature. So if nothing changes, we're headed for a 3.3 centigrade increase by the end of the century. And as we know, target is 1.5 if we want to avoid the worst of the climate impacts. This graph over here shows the current trajectory we're on for our mix of energy. So here's coal, oil, gas, here's renewables, a little bit of bioenergy, a little bit of nuclear. So that's our current mix and the trajectory that we're on to the end of the century. So again, we can test different policy. One person suggested, let's take some of the money that we've been subsidizing fossil fuels and invest in renewables. So let's do that. Okay. That certainly, even if let's maximize that to, you can see it brings down global temperature, and it certainly increases the growth of renewables. Okay. It's not a silver bullet, but an important piece that needs to be done, that's for sure. Someone mentioned, I think the bioenergy, oops, excuse me, it's to close. No, close, there, sorry. If we increased some alternative fuels, that also could have some effect. One of the things that we hear quite a bit, let's plant a lot of trees. I'm going to put this back for just a second so we can test this if it was just looking at that. We hear, let's plant a lot of trees. That certainly helps. It brings it down a bit. At the same time, as you can see, it didn't really affect our mix of energy sources. It didn't really affect the rate of burning coal, oil, and gas. We also hear, let's improve how we farm. This year, the Farm Bill is up for relaunching, and that's going to be such an important piece in increasing regenerative, climate-smart agricultural practices. So if we do that, again, that can make a difference. It's not really affecting the mix of global sources of primary energy. The suggestion about increasing investment in renewables does. What if we priced carbon pollution? And somebody mentioned that. Let's take all those indirect costs and put a price on carbon. So if we did that, again, it's not a silver bullet, but what a big difference that made in global temperature. And if we look at the energy mix, coal went way down, oil, gas went way down, renewables grew dramatically just by that one piece.
Now, what Linda has just outlined is a model by which you can test government policies that you might recommend to your politician. And it's really a lot of fun to play with this.
Oh, Curtis,
yeah.
If I could, let me back up just a second.
Sure.
I missed something here.
Okay.
That's okay. What I meant to show is if we do a price on carbon, and then we do these other things that people have recommended, more renewables, plant more trees, improve our agriculture, tackle methane gas, increase the electrification of our transportation, our energy efficiency. If we do these other things in combination with the things that everyone has mentioned, we're getting to a very, very hopeful scenario. That's for sure. Okay, back. Okay, thanks, Curtis.
Sure, Linda. And basically, Linda just showed us this model that's very powerful and very visually powerful. Citizens Climate Lobby, we use this in trying to lobby our politicians in Washington. And it shows them what will work and will not. And so it becomes a powerful tool to expressing what we should be doing. And if just to outline and recap where we are with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, here we are is the trajectory with the IRA without additional policies, about a 27, 28% reduction. Next slide, please. You add permitting reform, then we see the benefits from the Inflation Reduction Act, which is by most people's calculations and independent research groups would get us to about 40%, another 12%. But look at the power of carbon pricing. Again, another 12%. And then the other two are three ideas that both you expressed and Lynn reinforced in the model. Man, we're looking pretty good. We're below the Paris commitments if we get that all enacted. And next slide, please. The very aware of the effects of carbon pricing and how that has an effect on making us get to where we need to be. And if you're not familiar with this, we're going to spend a few minutes here discussing what it looks like. Next slide, please. So essentially what happens is that we assess a fee on the carbon content of fuel, both at the mine, at the pump, or at the port where it's imported. That money is collected by the U.S. Treasury. And the second essential element, which makes it so that it is socially just, is that all that revenue comes back to households as a dividend check. So this is a carbon fee followed by the dividend. Next slide, please. And the reason why this works is because fuels become more expensive, fossil fuels. We're going to burn less of them. And we're going to do it by improving the efficiency by which we use them and by insulating our homes. Industry is going to shift to alternative fuel sources. But we don't enact this policy without the dividend. By giving the money back to everybody, they can make their own choices about how to spend it. This allows them to decide if they're going to re-electrify their home, increase the insulation in their home, and instead of buying a gas guzzler, i.e. a large SUV, gas SUV, the next time they have to purchase a car, they may well choose a hybrid or an electric model. And the beauty of this is that most people that have independently researched this show that greater than 2/3 of Americans, or around 60%, depending upon what study you look at, next slide please, are better off than they would have been. And that's represented by the histogram bar to the left with the large green showing that about 67%, 60 to 65% of all Americans are better off, or all American households are better off if a dividend tax is enacted. But the next three bars, look at how much it benefits the people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. Notice that people that are in the first quintile of economic of income fare far greater than people in the fifth quintile. 90% of people in the first, 85% people in the second, and about 2/3 of the people in the third quintile. Higher income folks who are more responsible for more emissions will pay more. And, next slide please, those of you who say, well, this is not just the United States emitting greenhouse gas emissions, what are we going to do about China and India and the rest of the world? What you say put into place is really the third element of this, which is a carbon border adjustment. This allows us to tax the carbon content in countries that don't have a carbon tax in the products they attempt to import into the United States. This protects our manufacturers and it really significantly provides incentives for other countries to get on board with passing a tax. Next slide, please. So a carbon tax creates different benefits with regard to the reduction of greenhouse gases than incentives, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act do not. And there are four reasons why, and we're just going to quickly mention them. Next slide, please. The first is that it reduces demand. You recall when Linda was using the En-ROADS model, that providing incentives alone with regard to electrification and renewables really didn't affect the amount of energy we were consuming. All it did was redistribute it to renewables and seemed to have very little effect upon greenhouse and fossil fuel fossil fuel energy, which is the source of greenhouse gases. It incentivizes everyone by reducing demand. We will find each of us will find ways to reduce our energy use, and the dividend will give a means by which people can choose alternative sources, especially the poor among us, and therefore choose to electrify their home and at the same time provide more insulation. Next slide, please. It also addresses the hidden costs that someone mentioned. They said tax carbon, it takes care of the hidden costs. Well, that's really spot on here. Because right now, the full cost of the damage of fossil fuels is not borne by us. It's not borne by anyone. It really is borne by anyone, excuse me, and it's ways that we don't really see. With regard to healthcare, poor air quality causes 200 to 300,000 additional deaths in the United States each year, and contributes significantly, between 15 and 20%, of emergency room visits for children with asthma, all of which contribute to increased healthcare costs that we don't see, but really pay through added healthcare premiums that we might pay in our healthcare plans. Next slide, please. It also causes environmental costs with regard to storm damage, crop damage, forest fires, rising sea levels, as demonstrated in this slide. This particular slide looks at the number of billion-dollar events that we pay for through higher household insurance premiums, through increasing taxes required for providing resiliency to environmental change, the costs of drought, flooding, etc. And notice that already in 2023, there have been $23 billion disasters in the United States this year. From 1980 to 2022, the average was 8.1 events per year. And if you look at the most recent 5 years, from 2018 to 2022, it's about 18 events a year. So this is accelerating. The costs we pay, which are hidden, we pay, and the amount we are paying is increasing. Next slide, please. The third reason is that it eliminates the subsidies and the hidden costs that we just described here. Katharine Hayhoe, a number of you probably know her. She's a climate scientist and evangelical Christian who wrote Saving Us. She estimates this to be approximately $7 billion a year. And next slide, please. As an example of where that's hidden is demonstrated on this particular graph. The lighter shaded area is the implicit subsidies, the ones that are hidden, the ones we do pay and society pays through ways that we just mentioned, we don't really see but are actually paying. Even though we increased the explicit subsidies last year because of the war in Ukraine and Russia and scarcity of fossil fuels, we did it at a time when these companies were making record profits. Person mentioned remove the subsidies, as we heard in the chat. Yes, a carbon tax would help do that. Next slide, please. So, get rid of the subsidies. We prevent 5.5 million premature deaths per year globally. We increase government revenues by a considerable amount. We're back on track to cleaner air, cleaner water, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And then the speed with which it acts. If you notice the graph to the left in the last En-ROADS model, notice how quickly our consumption of fuels declined. When consumers begin paying the full cost of carbon pollution, it speeds up the transition to energy. And it taxes the people who are polluting the most. Next slide, please. The carbon border adjustment creates incentives for other countries to get on board, and it has a global impact, as represented by the graph in the upper right hand. Notice that China and India will have to get on board if a carbon tax is passed, and that it is a relatively small fraction of their gross domestic product for them to do so. Next slide, please. So we've outlined a policy that seems sound, and perhaps we ought to consider what's holding us back here.
Yeah. Well, Katharine Hayhoe again, it's more about politics than it is logistics. We know what to do. We just need the political will to do it. She, in her latest newsletter, she said, let's tax carbon pollution, give the money back to people. As she points out, 39 countries have already done it, including Canada. The rest of us just need to get on board. This world map shows all the countries have already done something related to carbon pricing. And what's interesting, just earlier this month, the first African Climate Summit ended, the leaders unanimously supported a global tax on fossil fuels. So let's pause there for questions, and then we'll close out. What questions have come up in the chat, or do people have?
We have a couple of questions here at Massanetta. We can start with that if you want.
Sure.
Hi, regarding environmental justice, the people who suffer the most, particularly from the air pollutants, are those in the are lower economic income groups, but they don't spend as much on fuel. I mean, proportionately, probably more, but they don't spend as much there. So what will happen is they accrue more injury, but they would get less back in terms of rebates on carbon expenditures. So if there must be some mechanism by which you can adjust that. And if you could explain that to me, please.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Curtis.
Yeah, let me just say, I think you might be a bit confused as to how the rebate part of this works. The money that the Treasury receives is divided equally amongst all people who have a Social Security number. So each person in the United States receives the same amount of money. Doesn't matter how much they consume in energy. We're not keeping track of each individual household's personal energy consumption. We're just looking at how much the United States as a whole burns. This includes industry, this includes everything. And the amounts of money are not insubstantial. Once this gets to around $50 a ton, each person in the United States would receive a check for about $450 to $500, maybe a bit more now. So that's a substantial incentive and improvement to lower. And one way that I think about this is that like a sales tax is a regressive tax because everybody pays the same amount regardless of the amount of money they have to live a decent life. A flat rebate is progressive because it disproportionately helps people who are spending every one of their dollars in order to put food on the table and to move around. So I hope that answers your question.
Just a quick follow-up on that. So the American Lung Association completed a study in 2016 that showed that for every gallon of gas, for every tank of gas that was burned, you generate about $11.85 worth of medical costs. But those costs were accrued in the areas of low income that were associated with transportation, be it highways, be it railroads, this sort of thing. And so these people are absorbing a disproportionate amount of the economic and health harms caused by burning fossil fuels. Is there a way to compensate them for the additional harm that they receive due to fossil fuels, since the harm is not spread equally across the U.S.?
If I could take that one, when you think through the carbon fee and dividend policy, as Curtis outlined, the beauty of that is it would quickly help all of society transfer to cleaner energy, which would help clean up the air in those frontline communities. As far as extra help for the poor or the lower income, we'll have to see how the most recent version of that legislation is how it is introduced. There was one version where a larger proportion did go to lower income. Other versions, it's, as Curtis outlined, just everybody gets the same, but those in low income would get you don't get the rebate based on what you use. You get the rebate based because you're a tax paying person. And so everyone gets the same, and you're going to get more back than you're spending. Some of those other pieces, the IRA, the infrastructure bill, those have extra money going to low-income communities. So those policies are in place in those bills. I hope that answers your question.
There was just an online question real quick, if I could just interject, from Jim, who asks, how do you determine the fee amount?
Well, that's pretty easy. Right now, when companies buy fossil fuels, the carbon intensity of those fuels is already being measured, and so there's a mechanism for measuring that, and the fee just goes right at, as Curtis outlined, right at the well, the pump, as it's being extracted from the ground. It's X amount per ton of carbon intensity. So it's charged the fossil fuel companies right at the source.
your question also asks about how that might be calculated. Well, there are robust models that suggest how much greenhouse gas emissions, linking greenhouse gas emissions to the amount of the tax and how much it would have to be to achieve that. So if you want to achieve a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions, you might use one of those calculators to figure out what that amount would be. And if you really want to send a signal to the private marketplace and to companies and to everybody else, make that tax escalating. Start out with a low amount so people get the idea and start to, take it in and understand how it's going to affect them. But promise them that that's not where it's going to stop. So it spurs the psychology of saying, well, it costs us a little bit more. It's going to cost a whole lot more in 3 or 4 years, gets people moving here. So 2 elements. Number one, figure out what you might predict the greenhouse gas emissions to be. You don't really know, but you probably have a pretty good idea. And then second, implement it in a way that uses the psychology of having to pay more in the future to implement it. So that's pretty potent.
The 2 areas where I've always stumbled when it comes to carbon fee and dividend is the very issues you've been talking about is how do you figure out the fee, how do you figure out the dividend? And you've addressed that, and so I don't expect you to do it all over again because you've already done it. So the other problem I've always struggled with is I can't imagine anybody in Congress from those oil and coal producing states ever going along with this. So I think politically this is a wonderful idea which is dead in the water. Help us figure that out because I don't think it can be figured out. Will Joe Manchin ever go for this? Hell no. So there's your problem.
Well, you raised a great point because 3,500 economists think it's a great idea. Business leaders, chambers of commerce, organizations all over say, yeah, this is what we need to do. And then as you point out, in Washington, oh, sounds like a tax. We're the party of no taxes. We're not going to do that. So the political will is where it breaks down. Actually, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was almost a carbon fee in that. It failed by 1 vote.
Guess whose it was?
Yeah, but and that was a Dem-only process. There are Republicans in favor of it. Mitt Romney has said, let's tax carbon. Lisa Murkowski has said she would be open to looking at it. So there is support. Like so many things, I think it needs to come from the ground up. If we send a strong enough message to Washington that despite your fears, we think this is an important idea because it's going to drastically reduce greenhouse gas, maybe they'll do it.
This is June. I may be a naive, but the dividend goes to households. But what happens about farmers and in businesses who have carbon intensive operations like tractors and combines and other businesses in America that are production facilities, or I can't think of any examples other than agriculture. There may only be, one household's share is not going to offset their costs, perhaps.
Let me speak to that. And I think I really understand the point of your question, which is which industries are do we not want to put at a disadvantage? And you can tailor this policy to protect some of them. And so which ones would you identify? And you identified, rightfully so, agriculture as an industry that we might want to protect. And earlier visions of bills that have been introduced into Congress, actually the last one, the Innovation and Dividend Act, Carbon Dividend Act, actually address that by exempting farm operations from the carbon tax. And that was a small part of the greenhouse gas emissions, because the fuel that they use on their farms is not particularly carbon intensive. The fertilizers they purchase certainly would be carbon intensive, but there are ways of carving them out. Now, I personally don't think that because we have industries that have to be decarbonized rapidly and industries have to do it, and you can think of the big five, and most people that look at this issue say that concrete, steel production, petroleum extraction, and refining, which leads to plastics, the fifth one, steel, concrete, and fertilizer production are all ones that need to be rapidly decarbonized. So while we might go ahead and protect farmers from increases in fertilizer, we certainly want to charge those fertilizers, those fertilizer people, the carbon tax, and because we need to rapidly decarbonize those industries, and they're going to be the most difficult to do so. So, I provided you a very long-winded answer. So, to cut to the chase, you can protect farmers. I'll just leave it like that. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Linda, you live in Traverse City. If you would drive south towards Chicago, you go right past my house south of Grand Haven, and then 3 miles later you go past the Campbell plant, and you would see endless rows of open cars full of coal from the Wind River coal mining region in Idaho that are waiting to be burned to generate our electricity. I would love to see that operation taxed heavily so that they would have an incentive to shut it down a lot sooner than they're planning to. But when Congress can't even agree to keep the government open, I just am not real optimistic that they'll say, oh yes, let's take a bold step toward the future. But okay, that's just my own despair that something's going to happen. Keep going down the shoreline. You come to the nuclear plant near South Haven, which is decommissioned. It's out of commission, but it's now they're now considering trying to restart it again. The carbon tax would not affect nuclear power, I take it, because nuke plants don't generate any carbon. I guess that's just a fact about new generation. So the carbon tax doesn't really get us toward renewables entirely, because it would leave the door open for nuclear, which some people think is a necessary part of the transition. I'm inclined to think it's just a dumb idea from the beginning and should be phased out as soon as we can. But is that right, that this initiative would really leave the nuclear issue kind of on the side? You could argue for or against it, and it's not affected by the carbon proposals?
That would be correct. Yes, it affects the carbon intensive energy sources. So if you remember the model when we were looking at En-ROADS, nuclear didn't change, but renewables went way up. You put a carbon tax on, coal, oil, gas shrunk dramatically, very quickly. Renewables went way up. And certainly there's lots of concerns on all sides of the issue related to nuclear. We know that there's fission, advanced nuclear in the works, but it's not ready for mass market yet. Maybe 10 or 20 years, who knows? Decades down the road, that will be a primary source. We'll see. But right now, wind and solar are the least expensive. most affordable renewables that we can go for. But yeah, it certainly would shrink coal. It shrink coal, oil, and gas, ramp up renewables, but it won't take care of everything. That's what, there really is no silver bullet. There's so many things we need to do. I don't know if there are any other questions. We'd like to wrap up with just a couple of things that people can do.
Can we ask one more question?
Sure.
Okay.
The carbon fee or carbon tax and dividend system it might be described as a stick for motivating change. In addition to that, there's also the carrot. And you may be familiar with Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, in which he proposes a carbon coin that would be given to those industries that are producing a lot of CO2 to the extent that they reduce their emissions. And it would be essentially, it would be an investment for them to reduce their emissions, and they would get essentially a positive result from that in terms of their own economic circumstances. It's an interesting proposal. I was wondering whether or not you all were familiar with that or not.
It's not something I'm super knowledgeable about. You know, right now we have a lot of incentives with the IRA and with the infrastructure bill. So there are a lot of incentives. Yeah, it certainly takes a multi-pronged approach, doesn't it? Yeah, as Curtis pointed out, if we just focus on incentives, sometimes we can, in a discouragingly way, we're not affecting demand. We could actually increase demand by offering incentives. So it's complex. There are no simple solutions, that's for sure. Okay, would like to thank you for that question. Would like to close out with just a couple of things that what can we do? Oops. For some reason not getting. Okay, here's what first we can talk about it. Catherine Hayhoe's book, Saving Us, when she talks about what are of the many things we need to do, the most important thing is to talk with each other. Have a conversation in your congregation. And one of the things that our action team has done, we've put together a discussion guide that can help with that. It goes through the various General Assembly recommendations and what does that mean for us, and looks at a lot of ways that as churches, as individuals, we can get involved. So we'll offer that as a tool. Other thing we can call or write. I know it seems discouraging. Can we get Washington to move? Well, I continue to be hopeful. I know Curtis does too. If our voice can matter. So calling or writing early and often, letting them know this is bold climate action is important. It matters for the future, for our future. And so that's something we can all do. We can certainly also look for action alerts through our Office of Public Witness. I think we mentioned, you know, there's so many things that come up that were related to environmental justice. We do expect that the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which would be a carbon pollution fee sort of bill, is going to be introduced before long. They're garnering supporters right now, so you can look for that action alert. And if you're interested, we would love to have you join our action team. So here's a way you can do that, and we would love to have you be a part of it. So that's what we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Mindy, did you have anything you want to add, or I think I think we're ready to break for lunch. And thank you, Linda. Thank you, Curtis. And we will be back here 12:30 p.m. Eastern.